Samuel Taylor Coleridge, his theory of imagination. One of the seminal minds of all times, Coleridge was a poet, critic, metaphysician, philosopher, psychologist, and an aesthetician, all rolled into one. Eliot hailed him as the greatest English literary critic. Coleridge's Biographia Literaria is called the greatest book of criticism in English by many, including Arthur Symons. His influence on succeeding generation has been profound. He is considered the forerunner of many modern schools like Imagism and Existentialism, to name but a few. His views about the organic structure of a poem, unity of being, and exemplastic imagination, and his distinction between fancy and imagination, with its further division between a primary imagination and secondary imagination, his theory of poetic diction, and his remarks on symbol and allegory are still relevant and command respect. Coleridge's critical works include, beside his magnum opus Biographia Literaria, his lectures on Shakespeare and other writings like The Friend, The Table Talk, etc. As in his poetry, his critical works too suffer from a lack of system and continuity. As a critic, he tells us that his attempt was to establish the principles of writing rather than to furnish rules how to pass judgment on what has been written by others. His task was to reduce criticism to a system. Essentially a theoretical critic, he practiced descriptive criticism only as an illustration. Biographia Literaria was written in 1815 and published in 1817. It is a summary attempt to marshal objections against the preface to Lyrical Ballads that had been growing up in his mind over the past 15 years, and to provide criticism with a systematic basis of his own. The first half of Biographia Literaria is largely metaphysical, and the second half is largely critical and occasionally autobiographical. Both Wordsworth and Coleridge agreed to write two sets of poems. In the one, the incidents and agents were to be in part at least supernatural, and in the second case, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life but were to be given the charm of novelty. Coleridge was to make the supernatural appear credible and to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. In other words, even while knowing that it is fiction, the reader has to willingly suspend his disbelief in it for the duration of his reading. The reader thus allows himself to be deluded temporarily to be able to enjoy it. His judgment or consciousness is sent to sleep for the time being. Like Wordsworth, he too talks of the poetic process as that would give us an insight into the nature of poetry. The poet, described in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity with the subordination of his faculties to each other according to their relative work and dignity. He diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and fuses, each by that synthetic and magical power of which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. Poetry is the result of the operation of the secondary imagination. Through this synthesizing and integrating power, The poet balances and reconciles opposing and discordant elements of sameness with difference, of the general with the concrete, the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects, a more than usual state of emotion with more than usual order. Poetry in the larger sense brings all aspects into a complex unity. It organizes, reconciles, and achieves harmony out of diversity. Immediate pleasure is not its whole function. Being a product of the simplistic power, it enables all the faculties to be brought into play simultaneously, each playing its proper part to produce a complex synthesis of comprehension. The philosophical distinction between fancy and imagination in its bearing on poetry interested Coleridge all through his life and is a central issue of Biographia Literaria. In chapter 13 of Biographia Literaria, he says that fancy deals in fixities and definities. It is a mode of memory and can roam at will, but only within the limits of the material world. It is somewhat mechanical and so is looked down upon. It is not a creative power at all, as it only combines the things into pleasing shapes instead of fusing them like imagination. It is not a unifying power. Coleridge distinguishes two types of imaginations, primary and secondary. His concepts of primary imagination is vague and is open to different interpretations. It is an agency which enables us both to discriminate and to order, to separate and to synthesize, and thus makes perception possible. It is essentially creative in the sense of bringing of order out of chaos, destroying chaos by making its parts intelligible by the assertion of the identity of the designer. The secondary imagination is the conscious human use of this power. It is more conscious and less elemental than the primary imagination, but it does not differ in kind from it. It projects and creates new harmonies of meaning. It is, in the larger sense, a poetic activity which is composite faculty of soul, consisting of all the other faculties, perception, intellect, will, and emotions. A more active agent than primary, it dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. Shaping and modifying a simplistic power, it identifies the mind with nature and nature with the mind.